Hello, welcome to tonight's episode of Open Courtauld Hour. Thank you for joining us. With lockdown lifted, you could be in a pub right now eating a substantial meal. Or a Scotch egg, I don't know, but you're here, and that means a lot to me. I'm joined tonight by my wonderful co-host, Dr. Edwin Coomasaru. Edwin, please turn on your camera and say hello, everyone.
Hey, my name's Eddie. I'm a research fellow at the Paul Mellon Centre and a co-convener of the Courtauld's Gender and Sexuality Research Group. And I'm really thrilled to be here tonight.
Well, I'm thrilled you're here too, Eddie. So the reason I've emerged from behind the scenes is to be this hour's host is because I think if the Courtauld going to put on an hour about our history through the lenses of rainbows, which we've called this, it's important to have someone who identifies with this phrase visibly leading the discussion. Now, despite being focused on public engagement now, I did start off my career with a PhD in art history. And before that, I studied history of art at both undergrad and master's level. Now, as a young gay person, I remember thinking that a lot of the theory on how images should supposedly be interpreted by people was really weird. One specific example I can remember is during an undergraduate seminar when we were talking about the male gaze, and that's Gaze. I feel I need to make that clear in this scenario. And I could see that my classmates, well, 90% of them, were all kind of nodding along like this phrase, the male gaze, meant something. But at that moment, what I was actually thinking was, what is a male gaze? Is the male who created the art we're looking at gay, straight, or some other label? Did he always identify as male? And do they even want to be perceived as male? And how can we be confident in our assumption of a stereotypical male way of seeing? And can some women of the supposedly male gaze have said women have a non-stereotypical take on how a woman should be and act? Anyway, my confusion led to some research into what this was all about, this seemingly well-known phrase, because it just seemed kind of problematic. But I knew that I had to know what it meant and how to apply it in a critical interpretation in order to get a good grade. So I played along. I think this trip down memory lane summarizes what this hour is about. It's about attempting to shine a light on how people who identify with, or at least acknowledge they can be aligned with the word queer, interpret art and art history. It's about how queer perspectives have historically got a little lost in the interpretation and academic analysis of art. And it's also about showcasing what academics, curators, and people working in the field are doing to correct this in the present moment. Now, before we begin, I just want to add that although I'm gay and I kind of identify as an art historian, I'm not a historian of queer art or theory. So I'm going to be asking questions as opposed to providing you with any answers. But what wonderful lineup of speakers we have for you to help us out with this discussion. Now, do remember you can, as always, you can ask a question by emailing us at researchforum@courtauld.ac.uk. That's researchforum, all one word, at courtauld.ac.uk, and maybe Layla will drop it in the chat for you now, or by tweeting us at courtauldres. Now, a lot of you have asked why we don't keep the chat open, and the reason for that is because the software we use means the chat can be very distracting when you're trying to keep control of your train of thought. So just do email and tweet, and Eddie and I will keep an eye out for any questions that you do have. Now, the first guests we have on are two of the Courtauld's own PhD students, Tilly Scantlebury and Andrew Cummings. Can you both please turn your cameras on, guys, and give the audience a wee wave? Hello.
Hello.
Hi.
It's lovely to see you both. Andrew, I feel like every time we meet, it's in some very formal Zoom call.
Yeah, I guess it's like that these days, but it's always lovely to see you. And thanks for your lovely introduction as well.
Well, thank you. And Tilly, I've not seen you in ages, given the year, but it's fabulous to have you here too. So I'm just going to give everyone a wee introduction to who you are and what you do before we get going.
Lovely.
So Tilly's thesis is called A Queer Rethinking, Families and Futures in American Art from 1990 to Now. And Andrew's thesis is called Strange Encounters in Contemporary Art from East and Southeast Asia, 1990 to present. In March 2018, so in the before times, Andrew and Tilly organised the Modern and Contemporary Postgraduate Colloquium, Queer Conversations, looking to art history and visual culture. this really very important event in the grand history of research forum events is why we've invited them to speak again now, and what I'm predominantly going to be quizzing them about. So shall we just get right into it, guys?
Sure, let's do it.
Yeah, let's do it.
Cool. So what prompted you to organise queer conversations?
I'll answer that one. There's quite a short answer, which is basically every year there's a modern and contemporary colloquium and someone has to organise it, usually a PhD student. And Tilly and I wanted to organise something around queerness specifically, because at the time, as far as we're aware, a conference about queerness hadn't occurred at the Courtauld yet. So yeah.
Excellent. And given it was such a kind of revolutionary topic, given the stage you were at in your studies, were you a bit worried about how queer conversations might be perceived by the Courtauld community as a whole?
Yeah, I mean, I think we were both, there was a degree of worry there for both of us, like with any event, I suppose, but maybe especially with this one, like you guys are saying, that it felt like it hadn't been done at the Courtauld before. But mostly I think, you know, the fact that it hadn't been done was what excited us about it, I think it's fair to say. And this meant, I think, that we were kind of willing to get over that nervousness or worry pretty quickly, I think, because we were just super excited about what that kind of conference might have the potential to do, really.
Yeah, and I mean, yeah, Tilly and I have spoken about this at the time and more recently as well. And an institution is made up of loads of people, right? And I think that not everyone got it, but I'm really glad that we stuck to our guns. And I'm not just saying this because we're on the Zoom call with you, but actually working with the research forum with yourself, and also shout out to Jess, who's not at the research forum anymore, and Grace as well, who's here. That was kind of when we felt the most supported and the most excited, and we really felt like you were all looking forward to the event too, and that helped us a lot.
I concur with that wholeheartedly, yeah.
Oh, thank you. I may have given the event a bit of special attention.
Thank you.
No.
The topic. Given what you focused on, can you maybe tell me and the audience a bit more about the ways that queer visual culture and artistic practices offer more inclusive and diverse ways of living?
Yeah, I think I'll start this one, Andrew. This question makes me think of like a phrase that's almost feels like worn out now, but I'm going to say it anyway because I really believe it. Is that it's hard to be what you can't see, because that's, I think, what we both, Andrew and I, think that queer visual culture has to offer us, you know, and by that I mean having visual models for new ways of living and being in the world. So that's kind of like a question of viability, you know, what is possible, I think, you know.
Yeah, and I was also saying that something that we both talked about is that you know, equally there's downsides to visibility. Visibility, as we know, can lead to more violence, more scrutiny, more surveillance, and that's actually something that queer artists, and particularly queer artists of colour, have been addressing for the last few decades, but especially as queer people have entered the mainstream a bit more, and as institutions have also sought to include and display queer art as well.
Yeah, I think also we both think quite strongly is that just having representation isn't enough. And I think that, you know, sometimes advances in representation and visibility kind of overemphasize as signs of huge progress. Or in some cases, you know, there's serious regressions in things like policies or politics that are happening simultaneously as representation is happening. So representation is important, but it kind of really has to go hand in hand with material conditions that make queer people's lives better, more protected, full of joy, like, you know, healthcare, mental health services, education. So I think, like, to conclude, that, like, I just think that visibility, yes, is important, and I think we both feel heavily invested in queer visual culture, otherwise we won't be spending our lives kind of thinking about it at the moment, but it needs to be kind of accompanied by an activism that's invested in kind of structural and material progress.
I completely agree. So everything we've spoken about has been quite positive so far. And I just wanted to get your thoughts on something I've been thinking about recently. And that is, do you think the application of queer theory is totally inclusive? Do you think sometimes that by academically exploring queer as a concept, it becomes inaccessible to members of the community that we actually strive to represent?
Yeah, I think that's a great question, and I'll jump in. I mean, I think a lot could be said about this question. A lot of time could be devoted to it, but essentially, I think, well, I know that Tilly agrees with me, and I'm sure you do as well, that it's not totally inclusive for various intersecting reasons. I think it's important to say that, like, when it comes to knowledge and theory, the academy isn't the be all and end all. But if we are going to talk about the academy, and that's the space that I'm engaged in, Tilly's engaged in, and a lot of us are engaged in here, there are kind of two issues here for me, and one of them is who is in the academy, who's speaking, who's being listened to, and the other issue would be, are academic ideas being disseminated outside of the academy and outside of academic circles? And looking at kind of the question of who's in the academy, I mean, take our conversation this evening as an example. It's still wild to me that I get invited to speak at these things, and it's really wonderful to be given the opportunity to speak alongside like our speakers who are all doing amazing work. But at the same time, I feel equipped only really to speak about my own quite narrow experience of queerness as a white middle class person assigned male at birth, who doesn't have a disability. And I'm sure everyone would agree that our conversation tonight would be even more equitable and even richer if, for example, we also had a Black contributor speaking about their experience of queerness, which is probably different from mine in some important ways. And as for kind of disseminating knowledge outside the academy, I feel like, Tilly, you could probably speak to this question quite well.
Thank you. Yeah, also thank you for articulating something that I think, first of all, fun asking the question, and also I think that's Andrew, what you said is a really great way of saying something really quite complicated. And to go to like your second point about thinking about outside of the academy, I think that my favorite part of being a queer researcher, and I think of that as like a double-pronged thing of like being a queer person and then being a person who researches queerness. My favorite part of that is actually sharing often really weird, complex ideas that maybe might be found in the academy, but with people who exist outside of that structure. For example, like this Saturday, I'm running a workshop for young people and thinking through queer art history and queer theory. And this is kind of part of Courtauld's free widening participation scheme. And I think I might get it slightly wrong, but I think there are like around 8 state schools in the UK that teach art history, which is obviously like a horribly staggering fact. That's like detrimental not only for both education, but also for the arts. And I think being able to talk to young people about queer visual culture seems to me to be like one pretty cool way of opening up that conversation early on with young people, and how like exciting it is to think about the huge breadth of possibility of subjectivity, looking at ourselves and the world that we're living in weirdly these days. And you know, I think to conclude, maybe I think if we think that our research is important, then we need to be sharing it around, like opening it up to other people rather than like gatekeeping that knowledge. You know, this is cheesy, another cheesy saying, but knowledge obviously is power. And so I think, you know, let's share that power around.
Yeah, and just to add to the end of that, actually, I think another great way of sharing academic knowledge and keeping it in dialogue with people is through events like these and like the Open Courtauld Hour and public programs and stuff like that. I think that's really important as well as teaching too.
For sure.
Excellent. That's kind of exactly what I hoped you would say and answer that question. So, thank you very much. So back to Queer Conversations, the event, can you maybe tell us what your main takeaway points from this were? Like, what did the event impact your opinions, your beliefs, how your research went from there?
Yes, is a short answer, and the long answer is we organised a day, like as the name says, around like the idea of a conversation. So like having researchers speak to each other about their research and seeing kind of the overlapping, intersecting ways that they might connect, kind of making us see that research isn't kind of like this hermetically sealed off thing that we each have, which I think is like quite unusual, because research feels so singular when you're doing it. You're like, I'm the only person in this world, my little world. And also that means that research is often like conclusive or definitive. But that day showed me that in my own research, I can kind of resist that singular or conclusive drive that is kind of heading me forward. And actually I can be way more open to other possibilities and different kind of conflicting ways of thinking within my research. So that's one thing. And that other thing I think I learned, well, I think it confirmed rather than, taught me, but it confirmed a feeling I already had, that there is like a huge, huge appetite for queer thinking and queer research. And it's our job, I think, to shout about it and to do more of it.
Yeah, definitely. It was very vindicating. And I, as you know, feel very similarly to you, Tilly. I think on top of that, like, it just made me think about the sheer breadth of thinking there is about queerness, how it relates to collecting practices, or how we might apply queer methodology to collecting practices, to museums, to how we think about the environment, to, of course, race, and how queer thinking can be combined productively with thinking in other fields. And I think beyond like academics and research, or beyond the kind of theoretical side of things, just working in collaboration was just great. I think like so much of the, I mean, Fern, I don't know if your PhD experience was the same, but I feel like so much of the experience it can be very solitary, and I feel like it's important to grab opportunities to work with other people. I mean, if that's what you want to do, but it's what I wanted to do. And it was so good to work with Tilly on this, also work with yourselves. And it's definitely, it was really invigorating. It was, I think for both of us, it was the highlight of one of the highlights of our PhD journeys.
Yeah, it's definitely one of the highlights of events I've had the pleasure of working with academics on at the Courtauld, because it brought in a topic that allowed people to explore something together. I mean, what you say about that solitary nature of the PhD, I think that's something that definitely has to change, and you predicting your little egg of knowledge, and it's all just a bit, you can argue that it's not the way that things really should be. And I felt like your event was steering us in the right direction. So thank you so much for putting it on, and thank you so much for being here tonight. You've been fabulous. I am now going to hand everyone over to Eddie.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.
That was so wonderful. I really loved listening to that. And I also gave a paper at the Queer Conversations conference. So yeah, I'd like to say like a huge thank you to Andrew and Tilly for putting that on. That was a really amazing event, and I really, really enjoyed it. I have the pleasure now of talking to Dan Bow, who is doing some really brilliant and amazing work at the moment when it comes to queer curating. I feel really grateful that he's here with us tonight. Dan, if you'd like to turn on your microphone and webcam.
It's lovely to be here. Thank you very much for inviting me.
So I'll give you a proper introduction now. This is an abridged version because Dan has been doing so many amazing things, but here's just a small taste. Dan Bow is the project manager of the Queer Heritage and Collections Network, supported by the Art Fund. He's founded the award-winning V&A LGBTQ+ tours, and as a freelance museum consultant has developed LGBTQ+ tours and programming for the University of Cambridge Museums, National Museums Wales, Tate Britain, and the National Gallery, among others. He's a trustee of Culture 24 and a patron of LGBTQ+ History Month. During lockdown, he co-hosted 2 days celebrating the museum sector on BBC Arts. It's so wonderful to have you here, Dan.
Thank you very much for having me. It's a treat. It's like nervous, you know, it's the Courtauld, but yeah, it's lovely to be here.
You're looking brilliant. I love your outfit. Very nice. So first up, I'd love to ask you, what does it mean to queer a collection?
I love this question because it means so many things, right? And for me, the thing that it fundamentally comes down to is what Andrew and Tilly were kind of talking about, is the idea that we're trying to put in as many voices as possible. And it's about looking at our collections and kind of looking at the gaps in those collections, going into a collection and sort of saying, you know, what's missing, what's being written and what's not being written, trying to read between lines, and then also identifying what's missing. And it's also about the voice, and it's sort of what voice is centered and how do we kind of spin that off that axis, how do we shift that? And it is about being inclusive, it's about being representative. And I think it's the aspects of it being involving contemporary collecting, commissioning of art and artists, and it's really just trying to address the gaps as well, because when Fern was talking about the male gaze, I'm going to now talk about the male gaze, the GAYS ones, that because of the nature of history and the way that it's been written, it, you know, white, cis, male, gay stories, we know a lot more about those than other stories. And, you know, there has been changes in over the last decades to readdress that. But I think there's still a lot more work to be done in terms of looking back at, you know, beyond the great and good of the great kings and queens of this country, for example, and who are LGBTQIA+, and starting to tell the everyday stories as well, and trying to find that throughout place, time, and culture as well, because we've always existed. We may have different terms used about us, but we've always been there, and it's about trying to go into the collection. And I love the word queer because it is such a flexible word. You know, it allows us to apply it on so many different things. And as Fern sort of initially opened with, it is about questions. It is about asking questions. And queer is just, it is just such a wonderful word to put onto things, because it allows you to keep questioning. And as time shifts and things change, you know, I think the word queer does allow us to kind of change that interpretation as we move along as well.
Thank you. I think you put that really brilliantly. I want to ask it might seem like a bit of an obvious question, but I think it's also a important one in very particular ways. But why is history itself so important to queer communities?
I think that it's because of that nature of us, the way that history has been written. We've had so long in which our stories have been removed, destroyed, obliterated. And here I'm talking directly about, you know, the idea of colonialism and the way that the British Empire spread the law that originally came from Henry VIII, the Burglary Act of 1533. Numbers ain't good, but I think that's roughly the right date. And how it has spread around the world at the rise, at the peak of the British Empire, and then it remains through to our day. And so for me, the reason why history is important is because we need to keep on going further back beyond that violent colonial contact to look at the stories that existed in so many different societies around the world prior to the imposition of this law and the Western sort of binary construct of gender and also sexuality, and which reshaped the way so many different societies understood themselves, understood sexuality and gender. I think there was, you know, a much more vibrant, diverse past, and, you know, we got to go way back and find that. And so I think that's why for queer people, that idea of history is really important, because you know, in terms of changing the law now, there's more than 70 countries in the world where it's illegal to be homosexual, and more than half of them are Commonwealth countries. So there's a very direct legacy there that we need to address. So in supporting the people in those countries in trying to reshape and reform the law, we are looking back beyond to a history that was actively destroyed, and to try to find the links that allow us to say, well, that law that you've got, if you go back in history, you'll find that that was, that way of thinking, a non-binary, non-heteronormative, non-Christian, not a non-oppressive way of thinking. That was your true history. And I think, therefore, you can remove this law that was imposed. So I think that's why history is important. And we've got collections all across the country that hold these stories, that hold the stories of gender and sexual diversity in the collections. And we start with objects, but it's sometimes also built into the fabric of buildings as well. As we look at some of the collections that are included in the Queer Heritage and Collections Network, you're looking at English heritage and National Trust properties and historic royal palaces, for example. If you start to sift through things like the properties that have a connection to slavery or colonial power, that's where it's kind of built into the system. You need to start to pick that apart and understand that better. And as you do that as well, I think inevitably what comes up is a lot of queer stories and narratives of individuals that have not been previously celebrated as well. And so I think that there's some really interesting work that's being done with the network, and also with the members of the network. We've got about 50 members that are across 4 nations of the country, and we're talking about small local authority members through to large national collections. And I think that everybody's got this sort of drive to be able to look into it in this way, and to look at some of the challenging narratives, but also look at the celebratory narratives that we can talk about LGBTQ+ people as well.
Absolutely. I think you put that so perfectly. I think the other thing is that, and this is something that you articulated really well, but all gender norms or gender and sexuality norms in the present narrate themselves as kind of timeless and quote unquote organic or transcending. But actually they were developed and came about in certain places and times, as you put really well, to do with certain power structures. And they will continue to change, and your work is really vital for contributing towards that. So what I'd love to ask you now is, what's next for you personally and a wider landscape of queer curatorial activism?
Well, I've actually got some slides, so if I could just very quickly share some of those. I'm just going to give you a little bit more about the Queer Heritage, Queer Collections and Heritage Network, and there we go. So the 5 partners are the National Trust, English Heritage, Historic Royal Palaces, Historic England, and the Research Centre for Museums and Galleries, which is University of Leicester. And so just to very quickly show you a picture that I really, pictures of things that I really miss, which is just obviously amazing people inside spaces. So here are some of the amazing teams that I work with across the country. And also, when you've got oodles of people piling into the museum to experience and celebrate queer love and queer lives across place, time and culture. This is from the National Trust, working on going into collections, and this is David McAlmont, drawing out some of these stories and then turning them into performances. And it's something that historic royal palaces are also great at doing as well, turning history into lived experiences that you can actually go to and experience, this like immersive theatre, making it alive again. And at the same time, working with communities, co-creating. And Historic England did an amazing project, which we're going to try and bring back to life now, which is called Pride of Place, which was about co-curating with communities, going in and pinning and collecting thousands and thousands of examples of places that people have been to and done things. For example, the Black lesbians here, they pinned the place where they started their Pride March, for example. So collecting all this data from the ground up, from the grassroots level. And also from, I think, some of the most amazing performances that we've had. We've just won an award, the English Heritage team just won an award for Our House, which, when you ask me the question of what's going to come next, this is sort of what happens next. This is the next generation. These are young people taking queer history and turning into a wonderful performance. And we are going to be actually screening the premiere of Our House as part of a conference that's coming up next year in January. So January 13 and 14, we're going to have it's a free symposium supported by the Art Fund. And it is going to be about sharing some of the best practice across the country in terms of projects and processes, things to do with collections and engagement and programming. And it's, we invite everybody who's part of the network to come along and join. So those of you watching, you can definitely get involved. So just, we've already put up on the event right now, just Google the words Queer Heritage Collections Network, it should turn up. And also V&A Academy are going to be having the very first queer history short course. So it's going to be a queer history of objects, and it's going to be some of the greatest minds in the country who deal with queer history and heritage presenting an amazing course as well. So I think that we're coming to a point now where we're actually starting to share, as I mentioned, best practice, but also start to share a very, very clear idea of how a collection, a museum, gallery, library, archive can actually really meaningfully engage with the community around them and create an impactful change that isn't just about our collection. It is beyond our walls. It's about how we shape community and culture beyond as well.
Brilliant, thank you. I've got a question from the audience, if you're happy for me to ask that. What are the key things currently blocking, outside of the work you're doing and other people, but what are the things that beyond the existing work that's blocking more activity when it comes to queering collections or increasing queer representations in collections at a local and national level?
I think there was a hint of discussion about this already, about the idea of that political discussions happening around us. And one of the hardest things to do is we do live in a very divided world, and some of the pushback that you get when you do this work, some of the really scathing national press and the attention that's given to, and the way that some people are really unfairly, given a hard go when they do this kind of work. I think that's the challenge that we need to overcome. And as a patron of LGBT plus History Month, it is always about the idea of that, the fingers crossed, education is going to be the thing that will overcome the day. And so I think, in light of all that pushback, each of these organizations that are committed to this idea of celebrating queer history and heritage, it's about recognizing that, well, clearly we need to keep on going. And in doing that, we're going to be challenging homophobia, biphobia, and transphobia, and we're going to be hoping to make everything a little bit better. I mean, one of the things that the young people said as part of the theatre production for Our House, one of the words that they said is, we are queer space. And I just love that. They went in and they took that space, they made it theirs. They decided that we belong here and this is our queer space now, and we are queer space. And that's what I love the most about it. And I think, overcoming that challenge, realizing that even though there's pushback, it means that we need to keep on going as well, is the key thing.
Thank you. I'm so grateful for all the work, all the brilliant work you're doing, and really lovely to chat to you this evening. Thank you so much. So next up, I'm going to introduce Florence Schlechter, apologies if I've mispronounced that, who is the founder of the Vagina Museum. The Vagina Museum is the world's first bricks and mortar museum about the gynaecological anatomy. The project is based in the United Kingdom and moved into its first fixed location in Camden Market, London, in October 2019. The Vagina Museum was founded in response to the lack of gynaecological representation within the culture and heritage sector throughout the world. So I'm really thrilled to have Florence, if you'd like to turn on your mic and video.
Hello. Hi. Thank you so much for having me. I am indeed the director of the Vagina Museum. I am dating a man currently, which means people are sometimes surprised to find out that I'm queer. And I have to be like, I made a whole vagina museum. What did you expect? And I thought I would tell you a little bit about it and also one of the projects that we did. So I have some slides to share, and I think one of the team is going to be sharing them on my behalf. There we go. So yeah, so this is the Vagina Museum. If you could go straight on to the next slide, those are our socials if you want it. We opened in autumn of 2019, and that is our front door just over there. We actually started the project in 2017. So basically what had happened is I found out that there was a penis museum in Iceland, which is great, don't get me wrong, but there's no vagina equivalent or gynecological equivalent anywhere in the world. And so I thought, you know what, I'm just going to do something about it. And we did pop-ups and like pop-up exhibitions and events and various things. And then we finally got our first premises in October. We then obviously had to close in March, but hopefully we're going to be reopening in a week or so. So if you can move on to the next slide. Just like Dan, I did want to share some lovely photos of the team just because I missed them and I wanted an excuse for some nice photos of, you know, me hugging people. So those are our trustees in front of the lovely glampons and sequiny menstrual cups that we have on display. Because our first exhibition, I'll talk about this a bit later, it's all about dispelling myths. And so we wanted to dispel the myths that periods were gross, and so what better way than to sequinify a moon cup? I mean, you know. Next slide. And then this is the team who I utterly adore, with like the office staff. So on the right, that's Sarah, our curator, and in the middle is Zoe, our development and marketing manager, and then you can see back there is our exhibition. We've actually refreshed it this autumn when we reopened in October. And the next slide. And these are some of our volunteers doing the training, and they're all great. This was our first ever batch of front of house volunteers, and I love every single one of them. And one of the best feedbacks we always get is how great our volunteers are. Next slide. So yes, so this is the first exhibition. It's called Muff Busters, Vagina Myths and How to Fight Them. And it's, you know, just because basically when we opened, we realized we had to start from the basics. And, you know, like we could have done this really in-depth exhibition about like the history of pubic hairstyles or something like that. But so few people even know words like vulva, that we thought, you know what, we'll start with some of the basics like vagina myths, like if I use a tampon, then I'll lose my virginity and things like that. So next slide. And this is our ultimate goal, which is to build a permanent museum that is holistic and encyclopedic in its outlook. We have, you know, big outreach program, and we generally act as a forum for issues related to the gynecological anatomy like feminism, women's rights, LGBT community, and the intersex community. Next slide. So the thing that I actually wanted to talk about, after giving a little bit of context about who we are, is in February of this year, we did a whole series of events for LGBT History Month. And one of those was Just Gals Being Pals, an art history crash course. And I've copied there the event description that we had. So I'll paraphrase it so you don't have to read it all. But basically, someone that we often work with closely, a person called Claire Mead, who is absolutely fantastic, and I'll introduce you to her properly in the next slide. She's worked with the Vagina Museum before and often does lots of stuff in queer activism with especially the erasure of like lesbianism and queer women. So for example, on here you can see on the right hand side there is a woodcut of two women lying down in bed, and the caption says, "There is no clue as to what these two women are doing in bed together. The image might represent a mistress and a servant, or two friends sharing a bed." And this is why Claire wanted to do this event, was because of like how, you know, lesbianism and queer women have been actively erased from history. And then we turned that into an Instagram sort of series that we did over a course of a few weeks. Next slide. So this is Claire, who is currently here dressed up as her drag king alter ego, Eugene de la Croissant, who is a museum sort of curator or museum director who thinks he knows everything, but actually really doesn't. And I've put on there links to her Twitter and Instagram, because you should go follow her, her Patreon, because you should go support her, for her webcomic, The Girls' School of Knighthood, which you can see just there on the left is one of the panels from the comic, because it's absolutely amazing, and it's all about lesbians who fight with swords. So I thought I'd share just a few of those pieces with you. So if you go on to the next slide. So this is The Sleepers. It was commissioned, oh dear, my camera setup is currently being held by a stapler. It's back now. This is called The Sleepers by Gustave Courbet. It has sometimes been called The Two Friends, even though that's quite clearly like a post-sex having a nap sort of thing. It was commissioned by a Turkish diplomat, but it wasn't shown publicly until about 1988, I think it was, because it was kind of known that this would cause such a massive scandal. This very like obvious depiction, not of just like female nudity, but also of like two queer women. It's now in Le Petit Palais, I think, somewhere in France. But what's so interesting about it is it's so obvious that they're like lesbians together or they're queer. But even so, people would still name this painting The Two Friends, because it was such a horrific concept. Next slide. This is another really interesting example of this. So this is Frida Kahlo, Two Nudes in a Forest, I think it's called. And it's sometimes interpreted as, so you see here, there's like these two naked women, nude women, and it's sometimes interpreted as the conflict that Frida Kahlo often experienced between her Mestiza ethnicity and her European ethnicity, so she was mixed race, and it was like the two kind of identities coming together. On the other hand, Frida Kahlo was absolutely bisexual, may have had, you know, affairs with people like Georgia O'Keeffe, another famous, you know, contested vulvic painter. And in fact, this is probably just an expression of her bisexuality. But to some art historians, such a concept is so horrific to them that they would rather interpret it as some kind of personal struggle that Kahlo is having with her ethnic identity as opposed to her sexual identity. Next slide. But in response to this, there has been an amazing, response to this erasure. There are, this is from the 1990s by Fierce Pussy, which is a collective in New York. And, you know, like there's lots of people now making very actively queer art, not because, like, I think because, okay, so obviously there has been a lack of it, but I think what I've been trying to say here is that it's not a lack of it because people weren't doing it, it's because people were being actively erased, and it's not the kind of thing that was taught or kind of accepted as part of mainstream society until fairly recently. So that's why I love pieces like this, because they show how, you know, sort of the pendulum has to swing the other way before it can settle in the middle, because who doesn't love a lovely piece that just has Dyke in huge letters in it? I mean, I like really feel that. I really love this piece. Next slide. So yeah, so that's just a few examples from just gals being pals. You must go follow Claire, and hopefully we'll be able to do more of this in 2021, but we'll see what happens. Thank you so much for listening.
And thank you, Florence, for taking time out to speak with us tonight. I had so many messages through that of people texting me they're not sleeping, which yeah, they weren't. So there's one question coming on the email here that I'd like to ask you, if that's okay. And it is, please can you tell us a little about specific queer artworks that have made an impact on you personally, and what should we see more of?
Oof. A specific piece. Do you know what? I think one that I really like is I Want a Dyke for President. So Google it. It's kind of like a poem, but in art form, and it's about the artist writes like, I want a dyke for president, I want someone who's had AIDS for president, I want someone who hasn't been able to pay their rent for president, and I love it so much, and I reread it over and over again because it resonates with me a lot, like, because especially nowadays I think, you know, we've really been struggling with politics for the past few years. And that's what I want. The thing that annoys me so much is that it seems like there are people in power who don't understand what it's like for the vast majority of people. We have all these, you know, Etonians and like loads of old white cis straight men who don't really understand what it's like for the rest of us. And I keep reading this and I keep like wishing for this future where I can have a dyke for president or prime minister. So that's one that's really resonated with me. And if you want to find more cool queer art, then you need to follow the gang on Twitter, because I think Twitter's the most fun place for queer issues, I think. And there's, so, you know, just like go on Dan's following list and just follow everyone that Dan follows and you'll be golden.
Excellent tip, and thank you so much for sharing that work with us. It's been fabulous to have you here.
Thank you for having me.
Oh, you're welcome. So now it's time for the grand finale. I'm very excited to introduce now for you Jay Hulme. Jay is an award-winning transgender performance poet, speaker, and educator, and alongside his writing and regular performances, he teaches in schools, performs sensitivity reads, and consults and speaks at events and conferences on the importance of diversity in the media. And in recent years, Jay has worked alongside or consulted with Amnesty International, the Centre for Literacy in Primary Education, Stop Funding Hate, and the Carnegie and Kate Greenaway Awards, among other groups on inclusion and diversity in literature. He has performed inclusion and sensitivity reads for a number of large publishers, improving the quality and accuracy of transgender representation in a number of books. So hello, Jay. How are you?
I'm all right. How are you?
Yeah, I'm all right. It's not a normal evening, but yeah, I'm good. So to close out the evening, you're going to be sharing a piece with us that's inspired by a drawing of a shepherd, specifically called A Shepherd with One Knee Resting on a Rock, and that's from 1875 by Hubert von Herkomer. Now tell us, Jay, why did you choose this specific work?
Well, I mean, look at him. I was like, I'm gonna have to write a kind of gay poem, and then I saw the shepherd, and I was like, I can write a kind of gay poem about you. I'm mostly a children's writer, by the way. This is great. I'm loving it. I was just like, he's really fit, so I'm gonna write a poem about him. And it turns out that the guy who painted him does like loads of stuff, art about poverty in the Victorian era and stuff. And here I am like, thighs. So I thought, why not? So I wrote a poem, not just about him, but sort of to him as well.
Oh wow, well, they are impressive thighs. So
They
I can't
are.
wait to hear this. So without further ado, please do take it away.
Before I start, I would like everyone to know that I spent a full week trying to make this poem the least horny it could be, just especially for you.
Oh wow, can we hear the alternative version once
No.
everyone else is on?
Absolutely not. So this is titled A Poem for Hubert von Herkomer's Shepherd with One Knee Resting on a Rock, mostly because if he can get away with a rubbish title, so can I. You watch over your unseen flocks while I stare at your thighs, those lines shaded in for shifting eyes. The surprise is that you come in this guise, shepherd of unknown name, unknown background, unknown fame. Were you drawn from life? An acceptable form of vice to stare at men for half your life for art in Grecian style, right? And who is it you're meant to be? I sent you to a priest, you see. He said it seemed quite honestly that you were drawn as David, the shepherd who became a king and killed a giant with a sling, famous for a maybe fling with Jonathan and everything. So perhaps you're meant to be a queer from ancient history. And as I stare at you, I see how important that could be. And even if that isn't right, I see those muscles in the night rippling to flee or fight, and like a wolf, I'd like a bite. But see, this poem goes off track. You might be hot, but now we're back to talk not of you as a snack, but symbol of all that we lack. For art like this, that's blatantly there for every gay to see themselves drawn up heroically with tousled hair and bended knee, is so rare. I cannot see it coming up with commentary that reads, it's gay and entries free, come ogle at them endlessly. But that is what we all must do, reclaim the art that's made for you. And even if that isn't true, we may as well just claim it too, because honestly, what will they do? Draw in every hand a boob graffiti, they were straight, so shoe on every canvas that could seem like the figures in it lean gayer than they'd like them be. Well, they can try and fail for free. The queers are here and we won't leave until we've had a turn at these endless empty galleries. We'll fill them with ourselves, you see. And it won't take much work to do. There's endless bits of art like you that just need a moment to be seen through a perspective new or old, I guess. For like I said, Dave and Jonathan in bed and all the love and life they led happened before Christ was dead. History is filled with gays distorted by colonial gaze, hiding queerness in a haze of they were friends, or so it says. But ever since we wrote or drew, the queers were doing those things too, and to erase us is not true to all that history should do. This poem's gone on quite a bit and I should write an end to it. A lesson or a thought will do, just something I can leave with you. So if there's one thing that I've learned from staring at this art, it's that seeing others just like you does wonders for your heart. And though there may be questions and the truth is drowned in past, the joy that comes from seeing others just like you will last. Thank you.
Wow, that was excellent, Jay. Thank you so much for contributing that piece. I loved it. And I do want to hear the other version.
So do a lot of people.
Okay, we are sadly at the end now. And it's been really honouring for me to have moderated conversation between such an exceptional gathering of LGBTQ plus voices. As an ex-student of the Courtauld turned employee, it amazes me how far we have come, not only as an institution, but as a community of people who support others and tailor events like this that react to the needs of society as a whole. The Courtauld and the research forum have come a long way in the 10 years since I studied here. I remember at the time thinking I was the only visibly queer person at the Courtauld, and in the beginning felt a bit out of place. And I'm not going to lie that that's maybe shaped how I've taken my career in this direction. So it's wonderful to me to even be in the position where we're doing this, and we've come a long way. So anyway, I just want to reiterate my thanks to our wonderful speakers for their time, and to you, our amazing audience, and to all the Research Forum team behind the scenes who have not only made this evening possible, but all the other Open Courtauld Hours that we've had over the course of this crazy year. We're going to take a wee break in January, but due to popular demand, we will be back in February 2021. If you did enjoy this event, be sure to join us for a Q&A with Dan Hicks, author of the new book, The British Museums, on Monday, that's this coming Monday, the 7th, he will be in conversation with Alex Bovey and Layla, your regular Open Courtauld Hour host, so you'll get her back. And full details can be found on the Courtauld website on the events page. Anyway, this has to be a record for Open Courtauld Hour. We're actually finishing 5 minutes early. But anyway, good night, keep safe, and we will see you very soon.